Hi, this is S.G. Brownlow with ADEPT Psychology. I hope you got a chance to watch my last video where I talked to Les Greenberg about emotion-focused therapy. Even though it was my second selfie video ever and it was kind of amateur and not the best thing on YouTube, I think it had some good content in it, and I'd like to talk a little bit today about what he and I talked about, because there were things that I had picked out of what he had said in 4 days of workshop that I thought were really important. The first thing we talked about was his belief that we focus on the wrong thing when we think about change. We focus sort of egocentrically on what therapists do and not on how clients actually change. And I would argue that I'd actually go a step further and say that even what we say therapists do, or what therapists say they do, is not what they're really doing when their clients are changing and making the most profound changes. So I think that's even a second reason to distrust our standard academic theories of change and counseling. The second thing that we talked about, I tried to sort of get him to talk about a little bit, or at least agree with my definition of sort of what EFT is and what a meta theory for EFT would be. And he did with some additions, and I agree with his additions, but as I think about it, I'm not even sure that my description of the meta theory was correct. I think what I said in the video was that we have these experiences that lead to a lot of different emotions, and we privilege one over the other, and because of that, we don't really look at what's underneath. I think really, as I think about it since then, what the videos that he showed us, what they really revealed was not so much the privileging of one emotion over the other, but rather that we would see people who had really fused emotions. So for instance, they might look sad, but they sound angry, and they'd be talking about feeling inadequate. And so they'd have parts of all three of those emotions going on, but none of it would really be expressing itself very fully. And so none of it would ever get worked out. As an aside, what the research shows about people with post-traumatic stress disorder is that that's exactly how they attempt to process their emotions. They just have these globbed up conglomerations of two or more emotions that are going on at the same time, none of which are ever really getting expressed because they're not congruent. And so you have to pull apart each of those strands: the sadness, the fear, the shame, the anger, and what Les didn't talk about, the disgust, because all of those tend to get glommed up with each other, and you have to pull apart each strand and sort of work through that congruently. And as you do that, then things settle down for the individual involved. And I think as I see that and put that description on what he was talking about and on the videos he showed us, and think about what I do with clients in ADEPT psychology, I'd say that we agree on that actually is a lot of what the work is about. The third thing that we talked about was his statement that he spends 2 years, or has to spend 2 years, training therapists how to become empathic, which the first time I heard it sounded crazy. But then when he said it again in the workshop, that was only the first part of what he said. I actually left the second part off. What he said was he spends 2 years teaching people how to be empathic and then tells them not to listen to what their clients say. And now this is training therapists. And my first response when I heard it the first time was, gosh, if it takes you 2 years, then you're training the wrong people. You should be picking people that are more empathic than that to do training with. But as I watched what he was actually doing, what he's calling empathy is a very radical form of empathy. It's not what Carl Rogers would call empathy. It's not listening and reflecting and you sound sad, but it's actually picking up very minimal cues from people. The forced expression, the strangled smile, the brief stolen glance over at the partner in couples therapy, and understanding what those mean emotionally and using that as a guide for where to take the session next. And as I watched that and saw how good some of his grad students are at doing this, I realized just how long and how involved this is, and realized why it would take 2 years to train someone to be able to do that. Because as Les said, it's because as empathic as they think they are when they start doing therapy, they have their own issues. They have their own places where their own emotions are fused. They have their own defenses around their own fused emotions. And so they haven't done the personal work of going through and pulling those strands apart and dealing with the sadness and the shame and the fear and the disgust and the anger. And so as I think about that, I understand exactly what he's talking about and why it would take 2 years. And if you've been following me, you'd understand why he would tell them not to listen to the client's stories. Because the stories will lead us to the emotions, but the stories will also distract us from the emotions because at root, they're defensive. And they're meant to keep that melded conglomeration of emotion in place without our being able to pull apart the strands and focus on one at a time and work it through. What I also realized, though, from listening to Les talk for 4 days, I knew we had some technical differences and maybe some differences in focus. And there's things that he does that I don't do. He's much more dependent on Gestalt than I am. And so he uses a lot of things like empty chairs and that kind of stuff that I've never felt comfortable with. On the other hand, his focus is very much on the presenting problem. A couple comes because they can't agree on whether to have another child. They're arguing about the same thing over and over and they're tired of it and want it to stop. An individual comes in because they've got some memory that they just can't get it out of their head and they feel like it's holding them back. And so there's this very specific problem that people are working on. And there's certainly a lot of value about that in therapy, but I think when you work with therapists, as I do, and as he's talking about training grad students to develop the kind of empathy that EFT requires, at least as he practices it, you're really talking about something more developmental. Because what I've discovered, I mean, really by accident, as I was testing some of the ADEPT procedures on my own emotional life, is that once you come to one of these places where there's a glommed up set of emotions at time one, and you pull it apart and work through each of the strands, and all of a sudden now time one is okay, but now you've got complications at time two, time three, time four, time five, that whatever you did at time one developed defenses that then had something to do with everything else that developed after that. Now, it doesn't take a long time to work through time two, time three, time four, time five, and so on. It kind of works through itself once you've done that, but it is nonetheless very developmental, and you come to various glommed up blocks of emotions at various times that need to be pulled apart and worked through before the person is able to have the kind of presence and empathy that Les was talking about. Which leads to why I work with therapists, why my focus is on sensitive therapists. Because, first of all, I understand sensitive therapists. I am very sensitive, and I've spent my life as a therapist. And so they're a group that I understand well and understand the dynamics of well. And I happen to believe that sensitive therapists deserve to have a good life and to get past all of the various emotional blocks and conglomerations and glued together structures of emotion that they suffer from. I also know that until they do that, their clients have no chance of having the lives that they deserve to have. And so that's why I've chosen to work with sensitive therapists. If you're the kind of sensitive therapist that I've been talking about here, please contact me. Let's see what we can do to get you on the road to having your emotions settled and worked through. You deserve a better life, better relationships, and so do your clients.